The summer sky above the Atlantic was Graham "Gray" Callahan's only refuge. The roar of his 1977 seaplane engine was his armor against the world, and Harbor, his German shepherd, always snored through every mile. Until today. Suddenly the dog went rigid. A low, urgent whine cut through the cockpit as Harbor pressed his nose hard against the plexiglass, staring not at the horizon, but straight down at the endless sheet of blue. Gray frowned, annoyed that their quiet ritual was breaking, but he followed the dog's gaze. Then he saw it. A flash of unnatural bright orange drifting alone on the glittering water. It wasn't debris. It was a life jacket, and inside it, a woman clinging to a shattered plank of wood. Gray's hands tightened on the yoke. The silence inside him shifted. He had a choice: keep flying to protect the peace he fought so hard to build, or drop into the unknown and risk awakening the ghosts he swore he buried forever. Before we get deep into the story, please let me know in the comments where you're watching from. Hit subscribe if you're hooked in and ready to enjoy this story, because tomorrow, I have another beautiful story to share with you and I don't want you to miss it for anything. Now let's get into the story. The Atlantic in July looked deceptively peaceful, a sheet of hammered glass touched by the sun, but Graham Callahan knew better. At 45, Gray had the look of a man shaped by years of salt air and places no tourist brochure mentions. His face was angular and weather-cut, his jaw set with the instinct of a man who once found razors useless in the desert. His steel-gray eyes, which once scanned horizons for enemies as a Navy special warfare operator, now scanned them only for silence. He had been excellent at his job, calm, precise, lethal, but excellence hadn't saved the friend he carried out of the dust and gunpowder years ago. That night carved a canyon inside him that no amount of isolation could fill. Retiring to the solitude of Maine, he rebuilt this old white seaplane to drown out the memories, his only companion a 90-pound German shepherd named Harbor. With a coat like a charcoal storm and eyes that held an uncanny intelligence, Harbor was the only soul Grail trusted. They were an hour out from shore when the ritual broke. As Gray circled the plane lower, the engine pitch changing from a drone to a growl, the details of the water came into focus. The woman below was motionless, her dark hair plastered to her cheek. But it was what she was holding that made Gray's blood run cold. The wood she clung to wasn't just broken, it was charred, blackened, scorch marks in the middle of the ocean. His mind whispered, "You don't owe this world a thing." But his bones whispered back, "You owe the same thing someone once owed you." As the pontoons kissed the water and Gray prepared to pull a stranger from the sea, he realized two things that would change his life forever. First, the burns on the debris meant this woman wasn't the victim of a storm. She was the victim of an attack. And second, if she was still alive, the people who did this were likely still hunting. And he had just landed right in their crosshairs. The Atlantic Ocean was not a runway, it was a living, breathing creature that changed its mood every 4 seconds, and right now, it wanted to chew the floats off Gray's seaplane. "Sit down, Harbor. Now." Gray's voice was a steel cable, tight and unyielding. It was the voice that had commanded squads in Fallujah and quieted panicked civilians in floodwaters. It was a voice that brooked no argument. But Harbor argued. The German shepherd, usually a statue of discipline in the co-pilot's seat, was frantic. He scrambled against the leather, his claws scrabbling on the floor mats, a deep, resonant bark slamming against the plexiglass walls of the cockpit. The plane bucked as the pontoons kissed the first swell, the impact shuddering up through the yoke and into Gray's forearms. "Harbor Platz." Gray shouted, reverting to the German commands the dog knew better than his own name. The dog dropped his haunches but didn't settle. His hackles were a ridge of razor wire along his spine, his lips peeled back to reveal wet, white fangs. He wasn't looking at Gray. He was staring out the window at the orange speck bobbing in the troughs of the waves, his growl vibrating through the airframe like a mechanical failure. Gray didn't have time to psychoanalyze the dog. He had to land. He feathered the throttle, feeling the wind shear push the left wing up. He corrected instantly, muscle memory taking over where conscious thought was too slow. The engine roared, then throttled back to a gargle as the floats sliced through the whitecaps. Water sprayed over the windshield, momentarily blinding him before the wipers slapped it away. The plane settled, heavy and wallowing, turning from a bird of prey into a clumsy boat. Gray killed the engine. The silence that followed should have been absolute, save for the slap of water against aluminum. Instead, it was filled with Harbor's snarling. "Stow it," Gray muttered, unbuckling his harness. "Stay here. Do not move." He grabbed the throw rope and kicked the door open. The smell of salt and aviation fuel rushed in, cold and sharp. Gray stepped out onto the pontoon, the ocean heaving beneath him. She was 10 yards out, clinging to a piece of charred teak that looked like it had once been the deck of something expensive. "Hey!" Gray shouted, his voice swallowed by the vastness of the water. "Grab the line." The woman looked up. Her movements were sluggish, her skin the color of skim milk. She wore a navy blue polo with a crest Gray couldn't make out and khaki shorts that were soaked through. Yacht crew gear. She blinked, her eyes unfocused, and for a second, Gray thought she was already gone, kept afloat only by the buoyancy of the bright orange life vest. Then she reached out. Gray threw the line. It was a perfect cast, landing across her shoulder. She fumbled with it, her fingers stiff and clumsy, looping it around her wrist. Gray hauled her in, his boots gripping the wet metal of the pontoon. When she reached the side of the plane, he grabbed the straps of her vest and heaved. She was lighter than he expected, or maybe the adrenaline was just doing its job. She tumbled onto the pontoon, coughing up seawater, her body racking with violent shivers. "I've got you," Gray said, steadying her. "We need to get inside. Now." He guided her into the cabin, maneuvering her into the rear passenger seat behind the pilot. The moment her foot touched the cabin floor, Harbor exploded. The dog launched himself against the cargo net separating the front seats from the back, his bark turning into a feral roar. He snapped at the air, his eyes fixed on the woman, pupils dilated, slobber flying from his jaws. "Harbor. U.S." Gray slammed his hand against the partition. "Enough." The violence of the dog's reaction stunned Gray. Harbor had been around injured people, traumatized people, dying people. He was a therapy animal as much as a companion. He absorbed pain, he didn't inflict fear. But the woman didn't seem to notice the 90 pounds of aggression lunging at her. She just curled into a ball, wrapping her arms around her knees, her teeth chattering like dice in a cup. I'm sorry," she stammered, her voice thin and reedy. "So cold." Gray turned his back on the dog, forcing himself to prioritize the human. Rescue protocol took over. "Assess. Stabilize. Evacuate." He reached for the emergency kit secured under his seat, pulling out a foil thermal blanket. He draped it over her, tucking the edges in tight. "You're in shock," Gray said, his tone clinical but gentle. He placed 2 fingers against her neck. Her pulse was thready and fast, tachycardia consistent with hypothermia and trauma. "What's your name?" "Nina," she whispered. She looked up at him, her eyes wide and dark, rimmed with red. We were just sailing." The generator, there was a spark. "Don't talk," Gray said. "Conserve your heat." He checked her pupils. Reactive but sluggish. No obvious head trauma, but the way she had been clinging to that debris suggested she'd been in the water for a while. Behind him, the growling continued. It was a low, constant rumble like distant thunder. Gray glanced back. Harbor was vibrating, his nose pressed into the mesh of the cargo net, watching Nina with a predator's intensity. A spike of worry pricked Gray's chest. Was the dog sick? He'd heard of brain tumors causing sudden aggression in older dogs. Or maybe Harbor was sensing something medical in Nina, some scent of death or illness that Gray couldn't detect. "Is he okay?" Nina asked, pulling the foil blanket tighter around her throat. "He's fine," Gray lied, though he wasn't sure. "He's just not used to passengers." That was a lie too. Harbor loved passengers. He usually tried to sit in their laps. Gray turned back to the cockpit controls. He flipped the avionics master switch and keyed the radio. "Portland approach, this is Seaplane November 09er Charlie. Mayday, mayday. I have recovered a survivor from the water at coordinates." He glanced at the GPS, rattling off the numbers. Female, approximate 35 years of age, suffering from hypothermia and shock. Requesting priority clearance to Mercy General. 83 5 minutes. Copy November 09er Charlie. Cleared direct. Medical services will be standing by. Gray kept the headset on one ear. He did a rapid scan of the instrument panel. Oil pressure good. Fuel flow normal. "We're going to get you warm," Gray said over his shoulder. "It's going to be loud for a minute." He didn't look back immediately. He was busy calculating the takeoff run. The swells were getting higher, and taking off with an extra passenger and a full tank of fuel required precision. But in the reflection of the glass dial on the altimeter, he saw movement. Nina wasn't shivering anymore. Or rather, she had stopped shivering for a split second. Her head was tilted, her dark eyes darting around the cabin. She wasn't looking at him. She was looking at the flare gun clipped to the side of the door. Then her gaze shifted to the transponder, then to the fire extinguisher. It wasn't the frantic look of a terrified victim seeking an exit. It was methodical. Left to right. Inventory. Harbor let out a sharp bark, a warning shot. Nina flinched, and instantly the shivering returned. She buried her face in her hands, letting out a sob that sounded heartbreakingly genuine. "Please," she moaned. "Just get me home." Gray shook his head, dismissing the paranoia. He was jumpy. The dog was making him jumpy. The woman had just survived a boat explosion and nearly drowned. Of course she was looking around. She was probably wondering if this rust bucket of a plane was going to kill her after the ocean failed to do so. "Hang on," Gray said. He pushed the throttle forward. The engine screamed and the plane surged against the water. Gray pulled the yoke back, fighting the drag, feeling the float skip once, twice, 3 times across the waves before the suction broke and they vaulted into the air. The sudden gravity pushed them all down into their seats. As the plane leveled out, climbing through 500 feet, Gray exhaled. They were airborne. The hard part was over. He glanced at Harbor. The dog hadn't relaxed. He was sitting rigidly upright, his body angled so he could keep one amber eye fixed on the woman in the back seat. He wasn't growling anymore, but the silence coming from him felt heavier than the noise. Gray looked back at Nina. She was slumped against the window, eyes closed, looking small and fragile in the crinkling silver blanket. 30 minutes, Gray said, more to himself than her. "We'll be there in 30 minutes. He turned his attention to the horizon, to the safety of the mainland. He told himself it was just a rescue. A good deed. A routine extraction. He didn't see Nina open her eyes. He didn't see her hands slide out from under the thermal blanket, her fingers tracing the edge of the seat pocket where Gray kept his backup comms radio. And he certainly didn't see the way her gaze locked onto the back of his neck, not with gratitude but with the cold, calculating focus of someone who had just successfully breached a perimeter. Harbor saw it. The dog let out a sound that wasn't a growl or a whine, but a low, mourning keening, as if he knew that the danger wasn't in the water anymore. It was inside the plane with them. The vibration of the radial engine usually soothed Gray, a mechanical lullaby that vibrated through the seat and into his spine, loosening the knots of scar tissue and memory. But today the hum felt like a drill press against his temples. 10 minutes into the flight, the air in the cabin had shifted. It wasn't just the smell of wet dog and aviation fuel anymore. There was something sharper, colder, sitting in the air behind him. Gray adjusted the trim wheel, scanning the instrument panel out of habit. Airspeed, 105 knots. Altitude, 1,500 feet. Oil pressure, green. But his internal sensors, the ones the Marine Corps had spent $1 million and 4 years tuning in the sandbox of Iraq, were blinking red. How far? The voice from the back seat was steady. Too steady. Gray glanced at the rearview mirror mounted on the windshield frame. Nina was sitting upright. The foil blanket had slipped from her shoulders, revealing the wet navy polo. 20 minutes, Gray said, his eyes flicking back to the horizon. Mercy General has a helipad. We'll land in the harbor and transfer you at the dock. And fuel? She asked. Do we have enough to divert if the weather turns? Gray frowned. It was a reasonable question for a nervous flyer, perhaps. But the weather was clear. High-pressure system, visibility unlimited. We have 4 hours of endurance, Gray said, keeping his tone neutral. What? You seeing storm clouds I'm missing? Just checking, she said. I like to know the variables. Variables. Not chances. Not risks. Variables. Gray felt a muscle twitch in his jaw. He knew about variables. In Fallujah, variables were the difference between a successful breach and a flag-draped box. He had lost Marcus because of a variable they hadn't accounted for. A secondary IED under a pile of trash that looked innocent enough until it turned the world into fire and noise. That day had taught Gray that innocence was usually just camouflage for something lethal. He looked in the mirror again. Nina was wringing out the hem of her shorts. Her shivering had stopped. That was what bothered him. Hypothermia was a greedy debt collector. It didn't just walk away because you put a blanket on. It took time to pay off the cold. 15 minutes ago, her teeth were clattering so hard he thought they'd crack. Now her hands were steady, her posture rigid. Her core temperature should have been fighting to climb out of the danger zone, leaving her lethargic and foggy. Instead she looked coiled. Beside him, Harbor let out a sharp whine that escalated into a bark. The dog wasn't looking out the window anymore. He had turned his body in the narrow co-pilot seat, front paws scrabbling against the center console, trying to climb over the throttle quadrant to get to the back. Harbor. Neen. Gray snapped, using his elbow to block the dog's chest. Harbor didn't retreat. He snapped his jaws, a display of teeth that would have terrified a normal civilian. The dog was fixated on Nina, his amber eyes wide with a mixture of fear and aggression that Gray had never seen in him before. Harbor was a SAR dog. He was trained to comfort victims, to offer a warm body to freeze-dried survivors. He didn't try to attack them. "Your dog seems spirited," Nina said. There was no fear in her voice, just observation. "He's protective," Gray muttered, struggling to keep the 90-pound shepherd in the seat. "Sit, Harbor. Stay." The dog reluctantly sank back onto his haunches, but a low growl continued to vibrate in his chest, a subsonic warning that rattled against Gray's ribs. Gray forced himself to focus on the controls, but his mind was replaying the rescue. The way she had moved on the pontoon. Clumsy, yes, but efficient. She hadn't panicked when he threw the rope. She had looped it, not just grabbed it but looped it, around her wrist to secure the leverage. He shifted his grip on the yoke, glancing back at her hands as she adjusted the blanket. In the harsh sunlight streaming through the cockpit glass, he saw them clearly for the first time. They were pale from the water, wrinkling at the fingertips. But the palms were rough. He knew the hands of the yachting crowd. They were soft, manicured, maybe a callus or two from a weekend of hauling halyards if they were serious about sailing. But mostly they were hands that held wine glasses and steering wheels. Nina's fingernails were cut short, right to the quick. Efficient. No polish. And along the ridge of her palm and the inside of her thumb, the skin was thickened, yellowed with old, hard calluses. Gray knew those calluses. He had them himself. They didn't come from sailing. They came from gripping a pistol grip and a forend for hours on end. They were shooter's hands. A cold prickle of sweat broke out on the back of Gray's neck, distinct from the humidity of the cabin. Who the hell was this woman? The radio crackled, making him jump. November 09er Charlie, this is Portland Dispatch. Status check. Rachel here. Rachel's voice was warm, familiar, a lifeline to the world of sanity he felt slipping away. Gray keyed the mic, keeping his eyes on the mirror. Go ahead, Ratch. Just checking in, Gray. You sounded a little tight on the initial call. Everything strictly routine up there? Medical is asking for updated vitals. Gray paused. You wanted to say no. The dog wants to kill her. She recovered from hypothermia in 10 minutes. She has hands like a grunt. But Nina was leaning forward now, her head tilted toward the headset, listening. We're stable, Gray said, choosing the word carefully. Passenger is alert. Conscious. Warming up. Copy that, Rachel said. There was a pause. You okay, Gray? You've got that tone. The one you get when the engine starts coughing. Just turbulence, Gray lied. Harbor is restless. All right. We've coordinated with the Coast Guard. They have a cutter, the Seahawk, about 10 miles off your port bow. They offered to intercept if you need to offload sooner, but I told them you're making for the hospital. Want me to patch you through to the commander? In the mirror, Gray watched Nina's eyes. At the mention of the Coast Guard, the mask slipped. It was micro-expression, gone in a heartbeat. A tightening of the orbicularis oculi, a narrowing of the pupils. It wasn't relief. A survivor adrift at sea hears Coast Guard, and they weep with joy. They slump. They exhale. Nina didn't slump. She froze. Her eyes darted to the window, scanning the ocean below, not looking for rescue but looking for a threat. No, Nina said loud enough for the mic to pick up. No detour. The hospital. Please. I need a doctor, not more boats. It sounded pitiful. It sounded like trauma. But Gray saw her right hand move. It slid slowly, casually down her side, slipping into the cargo pocket of her soaked khaki shorts. Gray? Rachel asked. You copy? She wants to proceed to mercy? Gray's heart hammered against his ribs. He was unarmed. His survival knife was in the door pocket, 3 feet away. The flare gun was behind him. He was in a tin can 1,000 feet in the air with a woman who played the part of a victim perfectly, right until the moment she didn't. Copy, Rachel, Gray said, his voice flat. Proceeding to mercy. Tell the Coast Guard thanks, but we're good. Roger. Dispatch out. The radio clicked off, leaving them in the roar of the engine. Gray looked at the mirror again. Nina was watching him. She wasn't shivering. She wasn't crying. She was calculating. She knew that he had seen her reaction. The silence in the cockpit stretched, tight as a piano wire. Harbor's growl deepened, a guttural sound that said what Gray was finally admitting to himself. He hadn't rescued a survivor. He had invited a shark into the lifeboat. You have a family, Gray? Nina asked softly. It wasn't small talk. It was an assessment of leverage. Gray tightened his grip on the yoke until his knuckles turned white. Just the dog. That's good, Nina said, and for the first time a small, cold smile touched her lips. Simpler that way. She leaned forward, and Gray saw the object she had pulled from her pocket. It wasn't a weapon. It was a small, waterproof GPS beacon. And the light on it wasn't blinking green for rescue. It was pulsing a rapid, angry red. She wasn't signaling for help. She was signaling a target. Change of plans, she said, her voice dropping the tremble entirely, replaced by the hard edge of command. We're not going to the hospital. Gray watched the red light pulse in the reflection of the glass. He realized with a sinking dread. The red light of the GPS beacon pulsed against the scratched glass of the instrument panel. Beat, 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 like a second heart, slower and colder than the one hammering in Gray's chest. Change of plans, Nina repeated. Gray didn't turn around immediately. He kept his hands on the yoke, his eyes fixed on the horizon where the blue of the sky met the blue of the water in a seamless, indifferent line. The plane droned on, a noisy aluminum cage suspended between two voids. I filed a flight plan, Gray said, his voice grating against the engine noise. If I deviate, they send the cavalry. You know that. I know they'll hail you first, Nina replied. Her voice had lost the reedy, high-pitched tremor of the victim. It was lower now, resonant and flat. And I know you'll tell them it's a mechanical issue. A sensor malfunction. You'll tell them we're diverting to a private strip for repairs. You're resourceful, Gray. You'll think of something. Gray watched the altimeter needle tremble at 1,500 feet. He calculated the physics of a barrel roll, a sudden dive, anything to knock her off balance. But he was strapped in. She wasn't. And she was behind him. You're making a mistake, Gray said. We land at Mercy, you walk away. I don't care who you are. You care, she said. You're a Marine. I saw the tattoo on your forearm when you pulled me up. Force Recon, if I remember the insignia correctly. You care very much. She shifted in the back seat. The rustle of the thermal blanket was loud in the small cabin. Gray glanced at the mirror. Nina was leaning forward, peeling the silver foil away from her body as if it were a shed skin. She stretched, arching her back, and as she did, the wet navy polo rode up her rib cage. Gray saw it. It was stark against the pale flesh that had looked so fragile only minutes ago. Not the anchor or swallow of a sailor, and not the haphazard ink of a college student. It was jagged, black, and precise. A scorpion inside a target reticle, and beneath it, a string of letters that weren't English. Cyrillic. Gray had spent enough time studying intelligence briefs to recognize the script, even if he couldn't translate the specific dialect. It was the marking of a specific rapid response unit, the kind that didn't exist on official rosters, Spetsnaz GRU or something even darker, something freelance that hired out to the highest bidder. Russian, Gray said, the word tasting like copper in his mouth. Nina saw his eyes in the mirror. She didn't pull her shirt down. Instead, she sat up straighter, rolling her neck with a sickening crack. The transformation was complete. The huddled, freezing victim was gone. In her place sat a predator who had simply been waiting for her blood to warm up. Freelance, she corrected him. Nationalities are so 20th century. I work for the contract. And what was the contract? Gray asked. Blow up a yacht? Kill a family? A weapons exchange? Nina said, her tone as casual as if she were discussing the weather. It went sideways. The sellers got greedy. They thought they could take the merchandise and the money. They were wrong. So you killed them. I sanitized the site, she said. Efficiency is part of the service. But the boat, the fuel line was more volatile than I anticipated. I ended up in the water earlier than planned. She leaned closer to the gap between the front seats. Gray could smell the ocean salt on her, but beneath it, the metallic tang of something else. 90 miles northwest, she said. There's a cluster of islands. Matinicus Rock is the landmark. Go 5 miles past it. There's a shoal with a rocky outcrop. My extraction team will meet us there. That's open ocean, Gray said. There's nowhere to land a plane that size in 5-foot swells. You're a good pilot, she said. And I'm not asking. Harbor let out a snarling bark, twisting his body to snap at the air inches from Nina's face. The dog's patience had evaporated. He sensed the predator. He knew, with an instinct older than language, that the thing in the back seat was a killer. Call him off, Nina said, or I will quiet him. He's a dog, Gray said, struggling to keep his hands steady. He senses stress. He senses that I'm considering killing his master, Nina said. Gray looked at the fuel gauge. They had enough to make the island, maybe. But landing in open chop near a shoal? It was suicide. And if I refuse? Gray asked. You can't fly this plane. I die, you die. I can fly, she said. Not as well as you, perhaps, but well enough to crash land near my team. I'd prefer a smooth arrival, but I'm adaptable. Gray's mind raced. He needed a weapon. A wrench, a fire extinguisher, anything. But the cockpit was tight and she had the high ground. You said it was a weapons exchange? Gray said, stalling. What kind of weapons? The kind that don't show up on thermal scans, she said. Prototype guidance chips. Small. Expensive. And currently in my pocket. So the explosion was a distraction, she finished. To cover the theft. The Coast Guard is looking for a tragic accident. They aren't looking for me. And you are going to help me keep it that way. I can't land out there, Gray said, trying to sound reasonable. The swells are too high. We'll flip. You'll try, she said. And if I don't? Then we have a problem. Nina moved her hand. It was a blur of motion too fast for Gray to track. She didn't reach for a gun. She reached into the waistband of her soaked shorts to the small of her back. When her hand came forward, it held something black and matte. It wasn't metal. It was a knife, but not like any Gray had seen in a standard loadout. It was a ceramic composite, non-metallic, invisible to wand detectors and X-rays. The blade was 6 inches long, serrated on one side, with a drop point designed for one thing, piercing soft tissue. She had been swimming with it. She had been rescued with it. She had sat shivering under a thermal blanket with a lethal weapon pressed against her spine, waiting for the right moment to draw. I've killed 5 people in the last 12 hours, Nina said. Her voice was ice. 3 on the boat. 2 in the water who tried to swim for the debris I wanted. I didn't enjoy it. It's just math. Variable elimination. She leaned forward, bringing the black blade into Gray's peripheral vision. You and the dog are number 6 and 7, she whispered. Don't make me do the paperwork. Harbor couldn't take it anymore. The proximity of the blade, the threat in her voice, the smell of adrenaline spiking from Gray, it broke the dog's training. With a roar that shook the cockpit, Harbor launched himself backward over the center console. He didn't care about the confined space. He didn't care about the altitude. He was a 90-pound missile of muscle and teeth, aiming straight for Nina's throat. Harbor N.O. Gray shouted, releasing the yoke to grab the dog's collar. But he was too late. Harbor's jaws snapped inches from Nina's face. Nina didn't flinch. She didn't scream. She reacted with the terrifying fluidity of a machine. She twisted her torso, bringing her left forearm up to block the dog's bite, sacrificing the arm to protect the throat, while her right hand drove the ceramic knife forward in a vicious, upward arc. The blade wasn't aimed at Gray. It was aimed directly at the soft, exposed underbelly of the lunging dog. Don't! Gray screamed, letting go of the controls completely. The plane banked violently to the left, the horizon tilting crazy and vertical, as the interior of the cockpit became a blur of fur, teeth, and black ceramic death. The seaplane shuddered violently as Gray kicked the rudder pedal, throwing the aircraft into a hard slip. It was a desperate, ugly maneuver, but it generated enough lateral G-force to slam Nina back against the door frame. Get down? Gray roared, his hand clamped on Harbor's collar, dragging the 90-pound shepherd backward over the center console. The dog was a snarling blur of fur and muscle, fighting the restraint, desperate to tear into the threat in the back seat. But Gray was stronger, fueled by a surge of adrenaline that felt like liquid electricity. He hauled the dog into the footwell of the co-pilot's seat, pinning him there with his right leg. Stay. Gray commanded, his voice cracking with intensity. Harbor whined, a high-pitched sound of frustration, but the tone of Gray's voice cut through the red haze of his instinct. He crouched in the cramped space, his amber eyes locked on the gap between the seats, watching for movement. Gray leveled the wings, his chest heaving. He looked in the rearview mirror. Nina hadn't dropped the knife. She had recovered instantly from the maneuver, bracing herself with one hand on the ceiling handle. The black ceramic blade was held low, steady, pointed directly at the gap where Gray's kidney was exposed against the seatback. Impressive reflexes, she said. Her voice was calm, almost bored. But don't try it again. Next time I don't aim for the dog. I aim for the flight controls. A severed hydraulic line or a slashed cable and we all swim. Gray's grip on the yoke was white-knuckled. He felt a sickening cocktail of emotions churning in his gut. Fear, yes, but mostly a corrosive, burning shame. He had doubted the dog. Harbor had told him. From the moment she stepped on the pontoon, the dog had known she was a monster. And Gray, in his arrogance, in his adherence to protocol, had suppressed the only honest instinct in the cockpit. "What do you want?" Gray rasped, staring straight ahead. "I told you," Nina said. "Heading 315. Northwest. There's a shoal past Matinicus Rock. Adjust your course." Gray scanned the instruments. "That's 90 miles. We're burning fuel fast in this headwind." "We have enough," she countered. "To get there," Gray said, his eyes narrowing at the fuel flow gauge. "Not to get back." "I don't recall asking you to come back," Nina replied softly. The implication hung in the cabin like smoke. Gray tightened his jaw. He banked the plane left, bringing the nose around to 315 degrees. The compass card spun and settled. They were turning away from the coast, away from the hospital, away from safety, and heading into the vast, empty expanse of the North Atlantic. "Good boy," Nina mocked. "See? We can be civilized." She adjusted her position, sliding to the middle of the bench seat so she had a clear line of sight to both Gray and the dog. The knife rested on her knee, casual but ready. "You think you can just disappear?" Gray asked, trying to keep her talking, trying to find an angle. "You think the FAA won't notice a medevac flight deviating course?" "They'll notice," Nina said. "But they won't panic. Not yet. Because you're going to tell them everything is fine." "I'm not telling them anything," Gray spat. "Oh, I think you will," Nina said. "Because I know you, Daniel Brooks. Or do you prefer Gray? A nickname from your unit, yes? Because you were always in the gray area. Neither light nor dark." Gray felt a chill that had nothing to do with the altitude. "You did your homework." "I always research the assets in my operational theater," she said. "I know you were Force Recon. I know you did 2 tours in Onbar. And I know why you're flying a rusted-out seaplane in Maine instead of contracting for Blackwater or Triple Canopy like the rest of your brothers." She paused, letting the silence stretch. "I know about Marcus," she whispered. The name hit Gray like a physical blow. The cockpit seemed to shrink. The sound of the engine faded, replaced by the roar of a memory, dust, shouting, the smell of cordite and copper blood. "Don't," Gray warned, his voice low and dangerous. "He died because you hesitated," Nina continued, her voice surgical, cutting through his defenses. "You waited for confirmation on a target. You wanted to be sure. You wanted to be right. And while you were being right, a 12-year-old boy detonated a vest and turned Marcus into a memory." "Shut up," Gray growled. Beneath his leg, Harbor sensed the spike in tension and let out a low rumble. "You couldn't save him," Nina said, relentless. "And now here you are, hesitating again, trying to follow the rules, trying to figure out the right thing to do while a woman with a knife hijacks your life. That's your weakness, Gray. You think the world has rules. It doesn't. It only has winners and casualties." Gray stared at the horizon. The rage was blinding, but he forced it down, packing it into a tight ball in his chest. She was trying to break him. She was trying to make him erratic, emotional. If he lost his cool, he died. If he died, Harbor died. "The radio," Nina ordered. "Call dispatch. Tell them we have a sensor light. Oil pressure fluctuating. Tell them we're diverting to the old airstrip on Monhegan to check it out. It buys us 40 minutes. "Rachel knows my voice," Gray said. "She'll know I'm lying." "Then you better be a hell of an actor," Nina said, leaning forward. She placed the tip of the ceramic blade against the back of Gray's neck. He felt the cold point pressing into his skin, right over the vertebrae. "Because if she suspects anything, if she sends the Coast Guard to intercept, I will kill the dog first. I will slit his throat while you watch, and then I will take my chances with the crash landing." Gray closed his eyes for a heartbeat. He could feel Harbor trembling against his leg. The dog trusted him. The dog had tried to save him. He reached for the microphone. His hand was shaking just slightly. He took a breath, forcing his heart rate to slow, forcing the soldier back into the driver's seat. "Portland Dispatch, November 09er Charlie," Gray said. "Go ahead, Gray," Rachel's voice came back instantly. "You close to the harbor? Medics are on the pad." "Negative, Dispatch," Gray said. He looked at his reflection in the glass. He looked old, tired. "I've got an amber light on the oil pressure. Fluctuation. Engine runs a little rough." "Copy," Rachel said, concern bleeding into her tone. "You declaring an emergency?" "Negative," Gray said quickly. "Temps are steady. But I don't want to risk the approach over the city. I'm going to set her down at Monhegan, check the lines. It's closer." "Monhegan?" Rachel paused. "That's pretty far out, Gray. You sure you don't want the cutter to come to you?" The knife pressed harder against his neck. A drop of blood trickled down his collar. "I'm sure," Gray said. Passenger is stable. We just need to check the hardware. We'll update you on the ground. November 09er Charlie clear. He clicked the mic off before she could ask another question. Excellent, Nina said, withdrawing the blade. See? You're learning. Gray wiped the blood from his neck. He looked out the windshield. The sky ahead was changing. The brilliant blue of the summer afternoon was bruising, turning a sickly purple and gray. We have another problem, Gray said, nodding toward the horizon. I see it, Nina said. A wall of clouds was building in the northwest, towering anvils of cumulonimbus stacking up like mountains. A squall line. The summer heat was colliding with a cold front, and the result was going to be violent. That's not just rain, Gray said. That's a thunderhead. Updrafts, downdrafts, hail. If we fly into that, this plane will come apart. My extraction point is on the other side of it, Nina said unblinkingly. Go under it. Go through it. I don't care. You don't understand, Gray said. The turbulence alone. I understand that I have a schedule, Nina snapped. Fly the plane, Gray. Or I start carving. Gray gripped the yoke. The first tendrils of mist whipped past the windshield. The air grew turbulent, the plane bucking as they hit the leading edge of the front. They were flying a metal kite into a meat grinder, with a sociopath holding a knife to his neck and a fuel tank that was rapidly ticking toward empty. But as the first heavy raindrops splattered against the glass like bullets, Gray saw something in the distance, momentarily illuminated by a flash of lightning deep within the storm clouds. It wasn't an island. Silhouetted against the dark gray curtain of rain, bobbing in the violent swell miles ahead, was the outline of a ship. It was black, sleek and running without lights. It wasn't a rescue vessel. It looked like a weapon carved from steel. And it was waiting for them. That's your ride? Gray asked, his voice hollow. Nina smiled, and in the darkening cabin, her teeth looked white and sharp. That, she said, is the Viper. And they don't like to be kept waiting. Gray looked at the ship, then down at harbor, then back at the storm consuming the sky. He realized then that the only way out of this wasn't to land. It was to make sure they never reached that ship at all. The cockpit was a pressure cooker, sealed tight against the drop in barometric pressure outside. The air grew heavy, charged with the metallic taste of ozone that always preceded a violent storm, but the electricity inside the cabin had nothing to do with the weather. It was the static charge of two predators confined in a cage, waiting for the other to blink. Gray held the yoke with a loose grip, letting the 1977 de Havilland ride the mounting turbulence rather than fighting it. Every bump and shudder of the airframe was a conversation between him and the machine, but his mind was entirely focused on the reflection in the rearview mirror. You weren't always a trigger puller, Gray said. He didn't turn around. He kept his eyes on the wall of charcoal clouds stacking up like bruised knuckles on the horizon. Your hands? You have the calluses, but you don't move like a grunt. You move like a ghost. Intelligence. In the mirror, Nina adjusted her grip on the seat back. The ceramic knife remained steady, but her eyes narrowed slightly. Does it matter? It matters because grunts follow orders, Gray said. Intel officers analyze them. And mercenaries? They usually just want the paycheck. But you're not doing this for the money. If it was just money, you wouldn't have killed the crew. You would have tied them up and vanished. You're profiling me, Nina said, a dry amusement in her voice. Save your breath, Gray. I've been profiled by experts at Langley and the Lubyanka. You're out of your depth. Langley, Gray repeated, catching the slip. So you were ours once. Or maybe there's working with us. Liaison? Double agent. I was a believer, Nina said, and for a second the cynicism cracked, revealing a deep, calcified bitterness beneath. I believed in the mission. I believed that if I did the ugly things in the dark, the world would stay bright and clean. Then I woke up. And realized the world is just shades of gray? I realized the world is a marketplace, she corrected. Patriotism is just a marketing strategy for the military-industrial complex. The people selling the flags are the same ones selling the coffins. I decided to cut out the middleman. So you became a butcher, Gray said quietly. I became a realist, Nina snapped. Don't try to save me, Gray. I see you doing it. You're looking for the good person buried under the trauma. You want to believe I'm another Megan Carter, another victim drifting at sea who just needs a strong hand to pull her out. I'm not a victim. I chose this. I chose the knife. I chose the cold. Beneath Gray's right leg, Harbor let out a rumble that vibrated through the floorboards. The dog hadn't moved an inch since Gray had pinned him in the footwell, but his body was as tight as a coiled spring. His amber eyes were unblinking, fixed on the gap between the seats where Nina's legs were visible. Gray realized then that the dog had known from the first second. Humans rely on words, on masks, on social cues. Dogs rely on chemistry. Harbor had smelled the gun oil on her skin, the pheromones of aggression, the lack of genuine fear. He had smelled the blood of the 5 people she'd killed before she ever touched the water. Gray had scolded the dog for breaking protocol, when in reality, the dog was the only one following the oldest protocol of all: survival. "He's still waiting," Nina observed, glancing down at the dog. "He thinks he can take me." "He knows he can take you," Gray said. "He's just waiting for the order." "Don't give it," she warned softly. "I like dogs. I'd hate to kill him." The plane dropped suddenly, a 50-foot plunge as an updraft collapsed beneath the wings. The engine roared in protest, and the loose gear in the back, a flashlight, a chart binder, slammed against the ceiling. Nina gasped, her hand flying out to brace herself against the window frame. For a split second, the knife wavered. Gray's hands tightened on the yoke. He could roll the plane now. Hard right. Put her on the ceiling. But he didn't. Because as the plane stabilized, he saw her hand move. Not to the knife, but to the overhead panel. Her eyes flicked to the attitude indicator, then to the turn coordinator. She understood the physics of what had just happened. "You fly," Gray said. It wasn't a question. "I have my instrument rating," Nina said, recovering her composure, though her face had paled slightly. "Helicopters mostly. But lift is lift." "That explains why you're not panicking about the storm," Gray said. "Most passengers would be screaming by now." "It's just turbulence," she said dismissively. "Air moving from high pressure to low. It can't hurt us." "That's where you're wrong," Gray said. He reached out and tapped the fuel gauge. The needle was hovering just above the red line. "Turbulence means drag. Drag burns fuel. And we are burning a hell of a lot of it fighting this headwind." He made a subtle adjustment to the mixture control, leaning out the engine just enough to make it sound rough, a rhythmic hesitation in the hum. Chug, chug, whir. "What was that?" Nina asked instantly, the knife pressing into his shoulder blade. "I told you," Gray lied smoothly. "Oil pressure. The engine is struggling. If we push through that wall of clouds ahead, the hail is going to shred the intake. We need to turn back. Or at least divert south." Nina leaned forward, her eyes scanning the panel. She looked at the RPM gauge, then the manifold pressure. She wasn't an expert on this airframe, but she knew enough to spot a bluff if he wasn't careful. "The manifold pressure is steady," she said, her voice suspicious. "Stop playing games, Gray." "It's internal," he countered. "A valve sticking. You don't see that on a gauge until the piston shoots through the cowling." She stared at him in the mirror, searching for the deception. The plane bucked again, harder this time, rain lashing against the windshield like gravel. The sky outside was almost black, a bruising purple bruise that swallowed the light. "We are not turning," Nina said, her voice hard. "The Viper is 5 miles past the squall line. We go through." "We won't make it through," Gray said, dropping the tactical calm and letting some genuine frustration bleed into his voice. "Look at it, Nina. That's a severe thunderstorm. It'll tear the wings off a plane this old." "Then fly better," she hissed. "I have a schedule to keep. And if we are late, the Viper leaves. If the Viper leaves, I have no extraction. And if I have no extraction." She let the sentence hang, the threat explicit. If she had no way out, she would leave no witnesses. Harbor growled again, louder this time, a sound that competed with the thunder rolling outside. The dog sensed the spike in her aggression. "Fine," Gray said. "We go through. But you better strap in. Because once we hit that wall, I can't guarantee you won't end up with that knife in your own ribs." "I'll take my chances," she said. Gray lined the nose of the seaplane up with the darkest, most violent part of the storm cloud. He wasn't doing it to obey her. He was doing it because he had just realized something. She knew how to fly. She knew how to fight. She knew how to kill. But she was arrogant. She thought the storm was just air moving from high to low. She saw weather as a variable to be calculated. Gray knew better. He knew the ocean and the sky were gods, indifferent and cruel. And if he couldn't beat her with a knife or a gun, he was going to have to use the only weapon he had left. He was going to feed them both to the storm and see who choked first. "Hold on," Gray whispered to the dog. He pushed the throttle forward, and the old plane screamed as it charged into the darkness. Visibility dropped to 0 instantly. The world became a violent gray washing machine. And then, through the static of the radio, a voice cut through. It wasn't Rachel at dispatch. It wasn't the Coast Guard. It was a voice distorted by encryption, cold and mechanical, speaking a language that made Nina sit up straight and Gray's blood run cold. Asset 1, this is Viper Control. We have you on radar. You are being tracked. Explain the deviation. Gray looked at the mirror. Nina's face had lost its arrogance. Tracked, she whispered. By who? By us, the voice on the radio said. Abort approach. You have been compromised. Clean the slate. Gray felt the tip of the knife dig deep into his skin. Clean the slate. In mercenary speak, that meant only one thing: destroy the evidence. All of it. Clean the slate. The command hung in the static of the cockpit for a fraction of a second, a digital death sentence. Gray didn't wait for Nina to acknowledge it. He didn't wait to feel the cold ceramic blade slide between his vertebrae. He saw the shift in her reflection, the subtle tensing of her trapezius muscles as she prepared to drive the knife home. He slammed the yoke hard to the left, kicking the rudder pedal to the floor. It wasn't a standard bank, it was a violent, structural limit-testing snap roll that threw the 1977 de Havilland onto its wingtip. At the same moment, the squall line hit them with the force of a freight train. A massive downdraft hammered the fuselage, dropping the plane 300 feet in 2 seconds. Gravity vanished. Then it returned, crushing and heavy. Nina, despite her training, wasn't strapped into the 5-point harness. She was thrown sideways, her body slamming against the starboard door with a sickening thud. The knife slashed wild, carving a gouge into the leather of the pilot's seat inches from Gray's ear. Now! Gray roared, though he didn't know who he was commanding, the dog, the plane, or himself. Harbor didn't need the command. The sudden violence of the maneuver had thrown him against the dashboard, but as the G-forces stabilized, the 90-pound German Shepherd found his purchase. The leather restraint loop connecting his collar to the seat frame, already strained from his earlier lunges, snapped with a sound like a pistol crack. The dog was free. Harbor launched himself over the center console, a missile of black and tan fury. He wasn't barking. This wasn't a warning. He went for the arm holding the knife. Nina screamed, a short, sharp sound of exertion, not fear, as the dog's jaws clamped onto her forearm. But she was fast. Unnaturally fast. She didn't try to pull away, which would have shredded the muscle. Instead, she drove her body into the attack, using her free hand to grab the dog's scruff and twist. The cockpit became a blender of noise and violence. The stall warning horn began to blare, a high nasal "ree" as the airspeed bled off in the turbulence. The windshield was a kaleidoscope of gray rain and blinding flashes of sheet lightning. Gray fought the yoke with one hand, his biceps burning as he tried to keep the wings level, while his right hand flailed for the fire extinguisher mounted beneath his seat. Get off! Nina hissed. She brought the ceramic knife down. Harbor yelped, a sound that tore through Gray's heart. The blade had missed the dog's neck but sliced through the top of his ear, severing the tip. Blood sprayed across the instrument panel, hot and bright red against the cold gauges. The pain didn't stop the dog. It enraged him. Harbor released her arm and snapped at her face, his teeth clicking inches from her nose. Nina kicked out, her boot catching Gray in the shoulder, driving him into the door. The plane pitched violently nose down. The altimeter unwound, 800 feet. 700 feet. You're going to kill us. Gray shouted, finally getting his fingers around the cold metal canister of the extinguisher. Then we die. Nina snarled. She had managed to wedge her back against the passenger door, giving her leverage. She raised the knife again, poised to drive it into the back of Harbor's neck. Gray didn't aim. He didn't have time. He ripped the safety pin out with his teeth and squeezed the trigger, sweeping the nozzle blindly over his right shoulder. A cloud of white chemical powder exploded into the cockpit. It was halon gas and dry chemical suppressant, cold and choking. It filled the tiny space instantly, reducing visibility from 0 to absolute blindness. Nina gagged, the chemical hitting her eyes and throat. The knife stroke went wide, burying itself in the upholstery of the co-pilot's seat. Harbor down. Front. Gray choked out, coughing as the acrid taste filled his mouth. The dog, confused by the sudden wideout and the chemical smell, retreated instinctively to the footwell, sneezing violently. Gray capitalized on the chaos. He shoved the nose of the plane down further to gain airspeed, then pulled back hard, leveling out just 500 feet above the churning black ocean. The G-force pressed them into their seats, and the white clouds swirled in the cabin, settling like snow on the dashboard, the floor, and the blood. I can't see. Nina screamed from the back. The chemical had done its job. Without eye protection, she was effectively blinded for the next minute. Stay back. Gray yelled, gasping for clean air. I'll dump us in the ocean. I swear to God, Nina, I'll roll this thing and drown us all. He heard her scrambling, coughing, the sound of wet boots sliding on the metal floor. She wasn't coming forward. She was retreating. She scrambled over the rear bench seat, moving into the small cargo hold at the tail of the plane, trying to get away from the lingering cloud of suppressant. Gray kept the extinguisher in his lap, his finger on the trigger. He wiped his eyes with his sleeve, smearing white powder and sweat. Harbor, he rasped. The dog was huddled under the dashboard. Blood was matting the fur on the right side of his head, dripping onto the rubber floor mat. But his eyes were open, amber and alert, fixed on the darkness of the rear cabin. He let out a low, wet growl. Gray looked at his own shoulder. His flight shirt was torn, and a line of fire burned across his deltoid where the tip of her blade had grazed him during the struggle. Shallow. He was lucky. The plane bucked again as they hit another pocket of turbulence, but Gray forced the wings level. He checked the gauges. Fuel, critical. Altitude, 400 feet. Heading, nowhere good. The cockpit was silent now, save for the roar of the engine and the drumming of the rain. The stall horn had stopped. The immediate violence had paused, replaced by a terrifying stalemate. Nina was in the cargo hold. Gray was in the cockpit. Between them was 4 feet of empty space, a cloud of settling dust and a 90-pound wounded dog. Gray didn't relax. He knew what was in the cargo hold. His emergency ditch bag, a flare gun, and the control cables for the rudder and elevators, which ran exposed along the fuselage walls. She didn't need to come forward to kill them. All she had to do was reach out and sever a single steel cable, and the Atlantic would do the rest. Gray stared into the rearview mirror, but the white powder coated the glass, obscuring the reflection. He was flying blind in a storm with a killer behind him who had just been ordered to erase him from existence. Then he heard a sound over the engine roar. Not a voice. Not a movement. It was the metallic click-clack of a breech being loaded. She had found the flare gun. Gray tightened his grip on the yoke, realizing that the fire extinguisher hadn't ended the fight. It had just changed the ammunition. She wasn't going to stab him. She was going to burn him alive from the inside out. The white dust of the fire suppressant was settling, coating the interior of the cockpit like a layer of toxic snow. It clung to Gray's eyelashes, tasted like chalk and copper in his mouth, and dusted the dark fur of the German shepherd huddled in the footwell. Gray didn't look back at the cargo hold. He didn't need to. He could feel Nina's presence in the darkness behind him, a pressure on the back of his neck that was heavier than the G-forces of the storm. He reached down, his hand trembling slightly, and rested it on Harbor's head. The dog flinched, then leaned into the touch. Gray's fingers came away wet with blood. The tip of Harbor's ear was gone, sliced clean by the ceramic blade, and the blood was pulsing, dark and hot, matting the fur on the side of his head. "I'm sorry," Gray whispered, his voice barely audible over the roar of the engine. "I stopped listening. I forgot the rules." Harbor looked up. The amber eyes were no longer confused. The chemical sneezing had stopped. The dog was breathing in shallow, rhythmic huffs, his body rigid. He wasn't looking for comfort. He was waiting for permission. Gray met the dog's gaze. In the chaos of the last hour, Gray had tried to be a pilot, a rescuer, a civilian. He had tried to de-escalate. But looking at the blood on his hand, he realized Nina was right about one thing. The world didn't care about rules. It only cared about who was left standing. He gave Harbor a slow, deliberate nod. Then he tapped his own chest twice with a flat palm, the silent hand signal they had used in stack formations in Ramadi. "On me." "Wait." Harbor didn't bark. He simply shifted his weight, digging his back claws into the rubber matting, loading his hind legs like pistons. "Gray." Nina's voice drifted from the cargo hold. It was rough, scraped raw by the halon gas, but the steel was back in it. "We are 4 miles from the coordinates," she said. "I can see the shoal on the GPS drop us." "I can't just drop," Gray said, his eyes scanning the instrument panel. "The sea state is 20 feet. I need to find a trough between the swells or we break the keel." "Do not play games," Nina warned. "I have the flare gun pointed at the fuel reserve tank behind your seat. One trigger pull and we don't crash. We vaporize." "I know," Gray said calmly. "That's why I'm descending. Look at the altimeter." He pushed the yoke forward. The nose of the seaplane dipped, and the stomach-churning sensation of falling returned. They were dropping through the cloud base, the dark, churning Atlantic rising up to meet them. "Good," Nina said. "Land near the black ship. They will send a tender." Gray banked the plane slightly to the right. To the untrained eye, it looked like a correction for the wind. But Gray wasn't lining up with the black ship he had seen in the lightning flash. He was lining up with a different vector entirely. He had lied to Nina about the radio. He hadn't just told Rachel everything was fine. During the chaotic struggle with the fire extinguisher, while the cabin was filled with white smoke, Gray's hand had found the switch for the ELT, the emergency locator transmitter. It was a silent scream. Once activated, it broadcast a distress signal on 406 MHz directly to the Sarset satellite network. It didn't transmit voice. It transmitted a location and a code: aircraft down. Immediate distress. He just had to keep her talking long enough for the cavalry to realize the mechanical failure was a lie. "The water is rough," Gray called out. "I'm going to have to flare hard at the last second. Brace yourself." "Just land it," she hissed. Gray watched the waves rushing up, mountains of black water capped with white foam. He saw the black silhouette of the Viper in the distance, a shadow against the rain. But he also saw something else. 10 miles to the east, barely visible through the mist, a strobe light flashed. White, white, white. It wasn't lightning. The radio crackled, shattering the tense silence. "November 09er Charlie, this is U.S. Coast Guard Cutter Seahawk." The voice was loud, authoritative, and impossibly close. "We are picking up your ELT beacon. We have you on radar 5 miles off our bow. We are launching a small boat for intercept. Squawk 7700 and acknowledge." The silence that followed in the cabin was heavier than the storm. In the rearview mirror, Gray saw Nina rise from the cargo hold. Her face was a mask of white powder and fury. The flare gun was in her left hand, but she lowered it. She realized instantly that firing it now gained her nothing. If the plane blew up, the Coast Guard would just fish debris out of the water. She had been outplayed. The Viper would never come in now. A covert extraction vessel wouldn't risk a confrontation with a U.S. military cutter. She was stranded. She was burned. "You signaled them," Nina whispered. It wasn't a question. "I told you," Gray said, turning in his seat to face her, abandoning the controls as the plane leveled out 100 feet above the water. "I don't leave people behind. But I don't let monsters walk away either." Nina looked at the window, then at Gray. The calculation in her eyes shifted. The cold, logical mercenary vanished, replaced by a cornered animal. If she couldn't escape, she would finish the mission. Clean the slate. She dropped the flare gun. It clattered uselessly onto the metal floor. Her right hand moved to her belt, and the black ceramic knife appeared again. "Then we go down together," she screamed. She charged. She didn't try to climb over the seats this time. She vaulted, launching herself through the gap between the pilot and co-pilot chairs, the blade leading the way, aimed straight for Gray's throat. Gray didn't raise his hands. He didn't try to dodge. He simply shouted one word, a command that released all the rage and discipline he had held back for the last hour. "Fass." Harbor didn't hesitate. The German Shepherd exploded from the footwell. He didn't go for the throat or the face. He went low and hard, launching himself vertically into the narrow space between the seats. As Nina flew through the air, Harbor met her. His jaws snapped shut on her right forearm, the weapon arm. The sound of teeth hitting bone was audible over the engine. Nina shrieked, her momentum arrested in midair as 90 pounds of dog acted as a living anchor. She slammed into the instrument panel, the knife skittering across the dashboard. But she didn't stop. She thrashed, her free hand clawing at Harbor's eyes, her boots kicking wildly at the throttle quadrant. One of her kicks connected. Her boot heel slammed into the mixture control knob, shoving it all the way forward while simultaneously kicking the yoke hard to the right. The engine choked, flooded with fuel, and then roared back to life with a terrifying scream of over-torque. The plane banked violently, the right wingtip catching the top of a 20-foot swell. The sound of aluminum tearing was deafening. The world spun. "Harbor, release." Gray shouted, grabbing for the dog as the horizon went vertical. But gravity took over. The seaplane cartwheeled, the wings snapping off, and the fuselage became a tumbling bullet aimed straight at the heart of the Atlantic Ocean. The Atlantic Ocean rushed up to meet them, a wall of churning black water that should have been their tomb. But the 1977 de Havilland was built in an era when metal was thicker and engineers didn't trust computers. When the right wingtip caught the swell, the float didn't shear off, it buckled. The strut screamed, twisting metal like taffy, and the impact skipped the aircraft off the surface of the wave like a flat stone thrown by a giant. The plane vaulted back into the air, engines screaming, airspeed critical, hanging in a sickening stall 50 feet above the water. "Gray!" The shout came from his own throat, raw and primal. He slammed the left rudder pedal to the floor, fighting the torque of the twisted airframe. The yoke vibrated so violently in his hands it threatened to shatter his wrists. But the fight wasn't just against gravity. Nina was loose in the cockpit. The impact had thrown her against the instrument panel, but she had bounced back with the resilience of a cockroach. She wasn't just a mercenary, she was a machine calibrated for violence. She knew the plane was dying. She knew capture was imminent. And her training dictated a scorched earth protocol. If you cannot escape, destroy the asset. She lunged for the yoke. Gray released his right hand from the controls to block her, his forearm colliding with her throat. It was like hitting a steel pipe. She didn't flinch. She grabbed his flight suit, using his own momentum to pull him forward, jamming her thumb into the soft cluster of nerves at his collarbone. Pain exploded in Gray's shoulder, turning his arm dead. "Let it crash," she screamed, her face a mask of white powder and blood. "It's over." "Not yet." Gray grunted. He managed to shove her back, but the plane dipped, the nose hunting for the water again. Gray grabbed the yoke, leveling the wings, sweating as the stall horn blared its panic. Then a blur of black fur entered the periphery. Harbor had recovered. The German shepherd, bleeding from his ear and battered by the G-forces, didn't attack blindly. He moved with the terrifying precision of a wolf taking down a stag. As Nina reached for the throttle to kill the engine, Harbor snapped his jaws around her wrist. He didn't shake his head. He didn't growl. He bit down, hard, crushing the radius and ulna bones, aiming to disable the hand that held the weapon. Nina shrieked, a sound of pure agony. She whipped her body around, driving her knee into the dog's ribs. Harbor yelped, the breath driven out of him, but he refused to release his grip. "Get off," she wailed, her free hand scrabbling across the dashboard. Her fingers found it. The black ceramic knife. She gripped the handle, her eyes wild. She raised the blade, aiming for the dog's spine. Gray saw it. He had a split second to calculate the variables. If he let go of the yoke to stop her, the plane would roll inverted and they would all die on impact. If he kept flying, Harbor would die. It wasn't a choice. It was an instinct. Gray released the yoke. The plane lurched immediately, rolling left. Gray threw his body across the center console, shielding the dog with his own torso. He reached out, his hand wrapping around the blade of the ceramic knife just as Nina drove it down. He felt the serrated edge slice into his palm, biting deep, severing skin and grating against bone. The pain was blinding, a white-hot poker driven through his hand. But he held on. "Drop it." Gray roared, squeezing the blade, his own blood acting as a lubricant, warm and slick. He twisted his wrist, using leverage against her broken arm. Nina cried out, her fingers spasming, and the knife clattered to the floor. The plane was falling. The horizon was gone. "Harbor. Drag." Gray shouted, shoving himself back into the pilot's seat. He grabbed the yoke with his good hand, his left, while blood poured from his right, slicking the controls. Harbor understood. The dog released Nina's wrist and lunged for her tactical vest. He clamped his jaws onto the Kevlar weave and threw his 90 pounds of weight backward. Nina, off balance and clutching her shattered arm, had no anchor. Harbor dragged her violently away from the cockpit, pulling her over the center console and into the cargo area. She clawed at the seats, at the floor, but the dog was relentless, a force of nature removing the infection from the body. "Brace for impact," Gray yelled. He didn't have the altitude to flare properly. He didn't have the airspeed to soften the blow. He had 20-foot swells, a twisted wing, and a cockpit full of blood. He spotted the crest of a massive wave rolling toward them. If he hit the face, they would disintegrate. He had to hit the back of it, the downward slope. He cut the throttle. The engine died. The sudden silence was more terrifying than the noise. The seaplane dropped like a stone. Crack. The impact was like hitting a concrete wall at 60 miles an hour. The remaining float sheared off completely. The fuselage slammed into the water, slewing sideways, skipping, spinning, and then burying its nose in the trough of the wave. Water, freezing, black Atlantic water, exploded through the shattered windshield. The world turned upside down. Gray was thrown forward against the harness, the belt cutting into his chest, snapping a rib. Darkness swallowed him. Then buoyancy. The plane bobbed to the surface, listing heavily to the right, sinking but not sunk. Gray gasped, spitting salt water and blood. Harbor. A bark. Wet, angry but alive. Gray fumbled with his harness, his right hand useless, his left shaking. He punched the release buckle. He turned. In the rear of the cabin, ankle deep in rising water, Nina was trying to stand. She was battered, her arm hanging at a sickening angle, her face pale. But she was still trying to reach for the door handle. Harbor was there. The dog stood between her and the exit, the water lapping at his chest. He wasn't biting her anymore. He was simply standing, his teeth bared, a low, constant growl vibrating in his throat. He was the warden. Nina looked at the dog, then at Gray. She slumped against the bulkhead, the fight finally draining out of her as the adrenaline crashed. "You're insane," she whispered, clutching her broken arm. "Both of you." "Yeah," Gray coughed, clutching his bleeding hand. "We get that a lot." Outside, a brilliant white light flooded the cabin, blinding them. The roar of diesel engines drowned out the wind. "U.S. Coast Guard," a voice boomed over a loudspeaker. "Hands where we can see them. Stay in the vessel." Gray leaned his head back against the seat. The pain in his hand was throbbing in time with his heartbeat, but the sound of the cutter's engine was the sweetest thing he had ever heard. He looked at Harbor. The dog's ear was bleeding, his fur was matted, and he was shivering from the cold water. But he hadn't taken his eyes off Nina. "Good boy," Gray rasped. "Stand down, buddy. We're home." Harbor sat, the water swirling around his haunches. He licked his chops, tasting the salt and the victory. The side door of the plane was wrenched open. 2 Coast Guard swimmers in rescue gear spilled into the cramped cabin, wet and efficient. "I've got the pilot," one yelled, reaching for Gray. "Secure the passenger." Gray ordered, waving them off with his good hand. "She's hostile. Watch her hands." The swimmer hesitated, then saw the blood, the knife on the floor, and the way Nina was looking at them. "Roger that," the swimmer said, moving past Gray. "Ma'am, let me see your hands. Now." As they cuffed Nina and dragged her out into the rain, Gray let the other swimmer help him unbuckle. He grabbed Harbor's collar, refusing to leave the plane without the dog. They were hauled onto the rigid hull inflatable boat, the rain lashing their faces. The massive gray hull of the cutter Seahawk loomed above them, a fortress of steel in the storm. Gray sat on the gunwale of the rescue boat, a medic immediately wrapping his hand in heavy gauze. Harbor pressed against his leg, shivering. Nina was at the bow of the boat, handcuffed, flanked by 2 armed officers. She looked back at Gray. Her hair was plastered to her skull, her eyes dark holes in the white searchlight. She didn't look defeated. She looked amused. She leaned forward, shouting over the wind and the engine noise. "You think this is a rescue, Gray?" Gray looked up, his vision blurring slightly from shock. "I think you're in cuffs. That counts as a win." Nina smiled. It was the same cold smile she had worn when she held the knife to his throat. "The Viper didn't leave because of the cutter," she yelled, her voice carrying an eerie calm. "It left because it deployed the payload." Gray froze. The medic trying to bandage his hand paused. "What payload?" Gray shouted back. "The prototype wasn't on the ship," Nina said, her eyes gleaming. "And it wasn't in my pocket. You were looking at the wrong hand, magician." She nodded toward the sinking seaplane, rapidly disappearing beneath the waves. "It's in the dog." Gray's heart stopped. He looked down at Harbor. The dog was panting, looking up at him with absolute trust. But on the dog's side, beneath the wet fur where the tactical vest had been chafing, was a fresh surgical scar Gray hadn't noticed before. Nina laughed, a sound that was swallowed by the storm. "Tick-tock, Gray. You didn't save him. You just delivered the bomb." The deck of the cutter Seahawk was a frenzy of shouting and halogen light, but Gray heard none of it. His world had narrowed to the sodden, shivering form of the German shepherd pressed against his leg and the terrifying accusation Nina had hurled into the storm. "Yodi, get the team up here. Now." The shout came from the boarding officer, Lieutenant Pierce, who had heard Nina scream about the bomb. 2 sailors in body armor rushed forward, grabbing Gray by his good arm and hauling him back. "Sir, step away from the animal. Step away." "No." Gray roared, fighting the hands that held him. The adrenaline that had sustained him through the crash was fading, replaced by a wall of agony in his hand and shoulder, but he dug his heels into the non-skid deck. "It's a lie. She's lying." Nina was being dragged toward the stern, her laughter turning into a hacking cough as the sea water caught up with her. She looked back, her eyes gleaming with malicious delight. "Check the cut, Gray. Check the cut." Harbor snarled at the sailors approaching him, his ears flattened, confused by the aggression. "Hold fire," Gray commanded, his voice cracking. "He's not a threat. Let me check him." Pierce looked at Gray, then at the dog, then at the frantic prisoner. He made a split-second decision. "You have 30 seconds. Yodi, stand by with the jammer." Gray fell to his knees on the wet steel, ignoring the jolt of pain in his shattered ribs. He grabbed Harbor's face, forcing the dog to look at him. "Stay, buddy. Stay." With trembling fingers, he ran his hand along Harbor's flank, finding the spot Nina had taunted him about, the surgical scar. It wasn't a scar. It was a crude, vicious incision, hidden beneath the fur near the tactical vest strap, likely made during the chaos in the cargo hold when Harbor had dragged her. Gray saw the glint of something metallic wedged deep inside the subcutaneous layer, held in place by the pressure of the vest. He didn't pull it out. If it was a pressure trigger, moving it could be fatal. "Scanner," Gray yelled. An EOD tech slid a handheld device across the wet deck. Gray swept it over the wound. The screen didn't flash the red warning for nitrates or plastic explosives. It pulsed blue. High-density RF transmission source. Solid-state memory. Gray slumped, his forehead resting against the dog's wet fur. "It's not a bomb," he rasped, the breath leaving him in a ragged sob. "It's the data. It's the prototype." She stashed it on him so she wouldn't be caught with it. Pierce stepped forward, signaling the all-clear. "Secure the dog. Get the pilot to the infirmary. Now." As the medics swarmed in, Gray looked up to see Nina being shoved into the brig access hatch. She wasn't laughing anymore. She was watching him with a cold, calculating assessment. She had played her final card, a psychological grenade meant to force them to kill the dog out of fear, and it had failed. But as the heavy steel door slammed shut on her, Gray knew the game wasn't over. It had just changed venues. The infirmary smelled of antiseptic and diesel fumes. Gray sat on the edge of the cot, his shirt cut away, while the ship's doctor pulled the final knot on the 17th stitch in his shoulder. "You're lucky," the doctor said, peeling off his latex gloves. The blade missed the brachial artery by 2 millimeters. "You've got 2 cracked ribs, a grade 2 concussion, and a hand that's going to need physical therapy if you ever want to fly a stick again. But you're breathing." "And the dog?" Gray asked, staring at the floor. "In the kennel bay," Pierce answered from the doorway. He was holding 2 cups of coffee. He walked in, handing one to Gray. The vet tech stitched his ear. "He's got some bruising, a few lacerations from the struggle, but he's tough. He's currently eating a steak that the mess cook definitely wasn't authorized to give him." Gray took the coffee, his hand still shaking slightly. "Nina?" "She's en route to a black site," Pierce said, leaning against the bulkhead. "Intel is having a field day. That chip you pulled out of your dog? It contains the guidance algorithms for the next generation of drone interceptors. She was selling it to a syndicate out of Southeast Asia. You didn't just stop a murder, Gray. You stopped a war." "I didn't stop anything," Gray muttered bitterly. "I gave her a ride." "You survived her," Pierce corrected. "There's a difference." Pierce reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, heavy coin. He placed it on the metal table next to the gauze and scissors. It was the commander's coin, the highest unexpected honor a cutter could bestow. "For the dog," Pierce said. "Crew voted. He's an honorary chief petty officer now, which means he outranks you." Gray touched the coin. He didn't smile. The weight of it felt heavy, like the guilt settling in his chest. Recovery was a slow, quiet hell. Mercy General Hospital was bright, clean, and safe, everything the cockpit of the seaplane hadn't been. But Gray couldn't sleep. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the orange life jacket. He saw the victim. He felt the knife. He had spent years building a wall around himself, retreating to Maine, flying his old plane, convincing himself that isolation was the only way to keep the peace. He thought he had buried the soldier. He thought he had buried the guilt of losing Marcus. But Nina had proven him wrong. She had walked right through his walls because he had opened the door. He had seen a damsel in distress, and his savior complex, that desperate, broken need to redeem himself for the friend he couldn't save, had blinded him to the predator standing in front of him. "You're thinking too loud," a voice said. Gray opened his eyes. Rachel, the dispatch operator whose voice had been his only anchor during the flight, was standing in the doorway of his hospital room. She looked different in person, smaller but with eyes that didn't miss much. "I almost got us killed, Ratch," Gray said, looking out the window at the parking lot. "You saved a lot of people," Rachel said, sitting in the plastic visitor chair. "Including yourself." "I ignored Harbor," Gray said. The confession felt like pulling a tooth. He knew. The second she touched the pontoon, he knew. He growled. He snapped. And I yelled at him. I treated him like a nuisance because I was so focused on being the hero. Rachel nodded slowly. "Dogs don't have egos, Gray. They don't have shoulds. They just see what is. You saw what you wanted to see. You saw a chance to fix the past. Vulnerability, Gray whispered. She used her vulnerability like a weapon. She knew I couldn't walk away from someone drowning. And now you know, Rachel said. Not everyone who cries for help is a victim. Some of them are just setting a trap. Gray looked at his bandaged hand. The nerves were still firing phantom signals, ghosts of the pain. I don't know if I can do it again. The flying. The rescue work. What if I hesitate next time? What if I leave someone who actually needs me because I'm scared of another Nina? That's why you have Harbor, Rachel said. He was right this time. Maybe next time, you just let him cast the deciding vote. It took 6 weeks for the hand to heal enough to grip a yoke. It took another 4 to repair the seaplane, replacing the float, the wing strut, and the shattered windshield. The locals called it a miracle that the plane was salvageable. Gray called it penance. He spent hours in the hangar, turning wrenches, smelling the grease and the dust, rebuilding the machine that was his armor. But the real repair work happened on the dock. Gray instituted a new protocol. Before every flight, he and Harbor would sit on the end of the pier. Gray would hold the dog's head, look into those amber eyes, and they would breathe. No commands. No expectations. Just a recalibration of the link between them. The day they returned to duty, the sky was a piercing, innocent blue, the same color it had been the day Nina destroyed his peace. They were 30 minutes into a patrol when the radio crackled. November 09er Charlie, this is dispatch. We have a report of a capsized kayaker near Egg Rock. Civilian observer says the subject is waving a paddle. Do you copy? Gray felt the old tightening in his chest. The flash of adrenaline. The ghost of the knife against his neck. He looked at the empty sea below. He looked at the fuel gauge. Then he looked at Harbor. The German shepherd was standing on the co-pilot's seat, ears pricked forward, looking out the window. He wasn't growling. His hackles were flat. He looked back at Gray, gave a soft woof, and wagged his tail once. All clear. Gray exhaled, a breath he felt he had been holding for 2 months. Copy, dispatch, Gray said, banking the plane. We are en route. 85 minutes. He lowered the nose, the engine humming a steady, reliable rhythm. The sky was still his sanctuary, but the silence inside him was different now. It wasn't the silence of avoidance. It was the silence of awareness. He knew now that the ocean was indifferent. He knew that evil could wear the face of a victim. But he also knew that he wasn't flying alone. He watched the water rush up to meet the floats. He watched Harbor brace himself, eager and ready. And as the spray hit the windshield, washing away the last of the fear, Gray realized that sometimes the greatest dangers arrive disguised as those we're meant to save. And sometimes the clearest truth comes from eyes that see without judgment, only instinct, loyalty, and love. The rescue was textbook. The kayaker was a teenager, cold but grateful and purely innocent. As Gray taxied the seaplane back toward the harbor, the sun dipping low and painting the water in shades of bruised purple, he felt a sense of closure. He tied off the plane and walked down the dock, Harbor trotting at his heel. But as he reached his truck, he saw something tucked under the windshield wiper. It was a small, cream-colored envelope. No postage. No name. Gray pulled it free, his heart skipping a beat. He tore it open with his good hand. Inside was a single index card. On it were typed coordinates, latitude and longitude. And below the numbers, a single sentence. The chip you gave them was encrypted. I have the key. If you want to know why Marcus really died in Fallujah, come alone. Gray looked around the empty parking lot. The wind rustled the pines. There was no one there. Harbor let out a low, menacing growl, staring into the deep shadows of the treeline. The hair on the back of his neck stood up, just as it had on the day they found Nina. Gray looked at the dog, then at the note. He realized then that the war hadn't ended on the cutter. It had just followed him home. Load up, Harbor, Gray said, folding the card and putting it in his pocket. We're not done yet. Harbor took a knife to the ear and risked his life to save a master who wasn't even listening to him. He gave his blood and his trust without hesitation. All I'm asking you to give is 1 second to hit that like and subscribe button. Don't be the person who ignores the loyal protector. Show Harbor some respect, hit the button.